Well, then the civil service gave me 35 years of a succession of jobs, each of which was more difficult than the last, each of which stretched me hugely, taught me that I could do things which I had no idea I could do. I used to think, I can't possibly do this job. And then I'd do it, and I found I could do it, and then they'd say, well done. Or they didn't actually say well done, they'd just say, we've got this new job for you. And it would be even more difficult, and I'd think, I can't do it, and then I'd find I could do it, and so on. And that's the story until I retired. And it began in private office, private secretary of a minister, looks after the minister, looks after his diary, his papers, his meetings, takes notes of all the meetings. Terrific experience for a young person, and teaches you a lot about how government works. We had Tony Crossland as president of the Board of Trade, then Roy Mason, and then we had the election in the summer in 1970, when we all thought that Mr. Heath would lose and that Harold Wilson was going to come back. And we sent, I was working for Wilfred Brown, Labour peer, and we sent him off the evening before and said to him, you know, see you in the morning, Minister. And then he rang me at 6 o'clock in the morning and said, I can hear him now saying, Richard, long silence, it's terrible, can I come in? And I said, of course you can come in, until the Queen has Harold Wilson's resignation, you can still use an official car. Come in. And he came in to collect his belongings, and we had a party in the office, we had drink in the middle of the morning, and we had people outside were tearing up the papers like the sacking of an embassy, and it was a sort of maudlin, extraordinary occasion. And then we packed him off about lunchtime when the Prime Minister had been to the palace, and then the quiet, an extraordinary quiet falls on government at that period when there's a change of government. Everything stops and everyone's waiting. And then I got a phone call from the Permanent Secretary's office saying, your new minister is Mr. Fred Caulfield. Will you please make contact with him and arrange to meet him and get him into the office? I rang him up. He was in Gloucestershire, and I hadn't got a photograph of him, and he didn't have the internet. And so he said, will you meet me at Paddington Station? And I said, how will I know you? And he said, I will be wearing a Concord tie. So I went and met him with his Concord tie on. And within minutes, you know, hours of Wilfred Brown having gone, we were then arranging first briefing meetings with the new Minister of Civil Aviation, as he was. And because there'd been a slight reshuffle, and I was dealing with a different subject. And I remember in the meeting suddenly realising that the glasses from the party, which we'd given for Wilfred Brown, were still behind the curtain. We hadn't cleared them out. No one understands outside government what a brutal business, cruel business government is for people, in terms of, you know, 1 minute you're there and the next minute you're out and you're nothing. And in terms of relationships, you work with civil servants for 3 years or whatever, and then suddenly you have no dealings with them and you can't look to them. And some people find that it is very hard to manage and very hard to handle.
It's difficult for them, but isn't it difficult for you?
Difficult for us too, yes, because it is part of. I mean, the way I dealt with it was always to think that they were my clients, and as long as they were my clients, my job was to find out what they wanted to do, to help find out how was the most practical way of implementing it, and to try and make it happen, and support them, because ministerial jobs are very difficult. And you do need a lot of support from the people around you. Quite often different people get anxious or worried or stressed simply by the volume of work which they have, because these are impossible jobs to do. And I was very and I learned a lot about that in those early days. Anyway, I had Fred Caulfield for 3 months, and then there was the October 1970 reshuffle, which the connoisseurs of the civil service were very important shake-up. It was when he set up the Central Policy Review staff, and it was the beginning of the criticisms of Whitehall's ability to make policy. But that's for historians of civil service. But I then had a new minister who it had all gone wrong. He'd fallen out with his private secretary, parliamentary secretary in what became the new Department of Trade and Industry, a man called Nicholas Ridley, who no one had heard of at that time, and who was very close to Enoch Powell. He used to go and see Enoch Powell, though a number of them did every so often, and sit at the feet of the great man. and who later became a key figure in Mrs. Thatcher's government, and where I met him again later. It was, a lot of my life has been like Anthony Powell's novels. People come through in different roles, like Cathy Ashton today, but that's another story. And so I rescued Nicholas Ridley from the mess that he's in. He didn't know what engagements he'd got. The papers were in chaos. The whole private office had broken down. We put it together. We moved him. We got our office together, and I worked for him for a year. We had, and in the middle of, there was a terrible week when the V&G affair, which nobody now remembers, broke, and I was thought for a period my career was over, which it wasn't. But I was told mud sticks and sometimes it's unfair. But anyway, it didn't turn out like that. But in the middle of that week, Frank Lee died, which is so that was the first time I discovered how, when one thing goes wrong, so many other things can happen at the same time. And then I was sent on promotion to the cabinet offices, my first spell in the cabinet office, on the assessment staff, which at that time no one could talk about, because it was where all the intelligence from all the different services were brought together and were assessed by a team of people who had brought to it an objective view, and whose role was to ensure that departments provided an independent, objective assessment of all the intelligence. And when I was on it, you were sworn to utter secrecy, and you were not allowed to mention the assessment staff, and you had great trouble in dinner parties. You couldn't talk about what you did. And I remember one occasion I mentioned the word Cheltenham, and I spent the entire dinner party mortified at the thought of having, well, even though it wasn't in any way improper, and I wasn't referring to GCHQ. But nowadays we're much more open, and everyone knows about these things. But that was a very interesting period, because although I began on what was then an experiment, which is the economic intelligence, I moved to political intelligence, and I covered the war with Bangladesh, because someone was ill. A lot of my life, important moments, stepping in when someone's ill is quite an important opportunity. I dealt with Bangladesh and the assessment of what that all meant, and of the new people. And then I worked for a man called Percy Craddock, a great man, on China. And I went out to Australia for a conference, and I did an assessment of, I got involved in doing political assessments of China and Hong Kong, and that was really interesting, or rather the attitude of China towards Hong Kong. And that was a really, really interesting
Did you visit
period.
China?
No, you couldn't. The idea that you could, I went to Hong Kong, and I stood at the frontier of the new territories looking north into China and seeing the Red Guard, but the idea that you would actually go into China with knowing the things you knew.
When is this, 70s?
It was 1973. You couldn't, and that period I did quite a lot of travelling, which is quite fun. I went to Siberia, and I went to Moscow, and I went to Iran, and quite a lot of good travelling as a private sector and so on. So I did that for 2 years, and then in October 1973 I was told that I was going to go to I was hijacked. There was a woman called Anne Muller, bless her, nice woman, diverted me wanted me to work for her, but I was diverted by the then Permanent Secretary, Sir Robert Marshall, to work on energy policy in the DTI, and I prepared myself for it. And at that time there was very clear energy policy, which is based on cheap oil, and lots of nuclear energy, and lots of coal-fired stations, and so on. And on the weekend before I was going to take up the job, the Arab-Israeli war broke out. The oil price started on that spiralling upwards, which ended up in being quadrupled. The 3-day week and all of that developed, and I found myself in the middle of the energy policy crisis, in what on the 8th of January 1974 became a separate department, the Department of Energy. And I was writing speeches by candlelight, saying there is no energy crisis. I remember having to, because there were endless debates in Parliament, and I was working on, and then all sorts of things became important, like energy conservation, I discovered, which no one had ever dealt with since the Attlee government. Energy efficiency suddenly became a topic, which was my job. So I was dealing with energy efficiency, renewable sources, all the things that people now talk about, wind power and wave power and geothermal energy and all those options. I was dealing with energy conservation, all the renewable sources of energy, and putting together an energy policy for the UK that took account of the new price of oil. So it was a fantastic job. I was frantically busy, writing endless things. And North Sea oil had just been discovered, and every year we were upgrading our resources of North Sea oil and gas. Extraordinary achievement, exploiting North Sea oil and gas. And suddenly I found myself in a department which was at the cutting edge of a lot of important policy issues at a time when they were really very important within government. And it attracted, it was only about 1,000 people, it attracted a generation of people, a lot of them with scientific backing, who were excited by energy issues. And it was a marvellous department. It was a young department, untravelled by a lot of history, which some departments are. And it was very... and I made lots of friends there, and it was very talented, and it was a good place to be. And I got promoted there in 1976 to deal with nuclear power, which was a hugely contentious area. And I dealt with nuclear power policy, thermal reactor policy, and fast reactor policy, and the finances of the UK Atomic Energy Authority, the financing of the research programme. At a time of thermal reactor choice, when the new nuclear power stations were being ordered, and the question was, should the thermal reactor system be the American light water reactors, pressurised water reactors, or should we continue to use the British gas-cooled reactors? Or should we actually go with what Eric Varley had chosen, the then Secretary of State for Energy in 1974, which was a steam-generating heavy water reactor, which mercifully the AEA came in pretty much the week I took over, and said we can't go on with this. So I had a fascinating period. I'd never dealt with expenditure before, and I was responsible for £400 million of money, which I learned how to deal with money, as it were, on the job, because I hadn't had any training. It was in the day when a gentleman knows how to do whatever he's asked to do. I learned the science about nuclear power stations. I went inside reactors before they became, heated up. And I was working for Tony Benn, who I'd worked for 4 years. And that was exciting because he was in a minority within the Callaghan government. He'd been sent there in exile on the 4th of June 1976. And he didn't want to be doing that, and he didn't want to be ordering nuclear power stations, but the pressures on him from the centre were extremely tough. And so I found myself dealing not only with a subject matter which is highly contentious, that people felt passionately about gas-cooled against water technology. The industry was split down the middle. It had the passions of a war of religion. The technical and industrialist issues were very complicated. And on top of it, we had all superimposed this extremely difficult relationship between Tony Benn and the centre, when he was saying he didn't want us to talk to the centre without his permission. And the centre would ring me up from the CPRS or from number 10, asking me for briefing. And I found myself, it was a very good experience in actually managing difficult political issues in important policy areas. And Ben stopped talking to the permanent secretary, to the deputy secretary and the under secretary, and only dealt with me, and I appeared in his diaries as a junior official. And I found myself in very difficult situations where my senior managers were telling me not to give Ben, write the papers that Ben wanted, because Ben had not reached a decision yet, because he hadn't told them what his decision was. And Ben was instructing his special advisors, Francis Morel and Francis Cripps, to work with me on papers. And I was having to say to them, you can't say that because it's not true. So I was dealing with special advisors. I was dealing with special advisors, politics at quite a high level, in quite a delicate position. And we got through it. We pulled out of it. 2 advanced gas-cooled reactor orders, which Tony Benn favoured gas-cooled reactor technology, Torness and Heysham, and also a design study on Sizewell. And then when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in 1979, suddenly the whole thing changed, because Walter Marshall, the head of the AEA, was a close friend of Mrs. Thatcher. She was very strongly in favour of nuclear power. And the Sizewell design study, which I'd got through, became the new project, and the Sizewell order was due to be placed. Of course, it got bogged down in the planning inquiry and it didn't happen. There was a period, I drafted the statement to Parliament that said that there would be 1 new nuclear power station order a year for a decade, which no one remembers happened, but there was a sort of great surge. So that was a very rewarding 4 years, and I learnt a lot of things about handling high politics, handling policy, handling the centre.
Advice?
Sorry?
advice to a young, aspiring civil servant from in handling all these things?
Try to keep good relations with everybody. And try to work out what the right answer, what the best advice is, and try and see if you can navigate it through. And don't get thrown by all the politics that go on. I remember Toby Aldington, who's the former minister, who was I dealt with a lot, because a lot of it was involved Arnold Weinstock and GEC, saying his advice to me at the time was, never let them know how clever you are. And that was remarkable. I always remembered. He said, keep them guessing. Don't show your hand. And it was very interesting. He was a nice figure. And I got promoted. No, I didn't get promoted then. I got moved to deal with North Sea oil and gas policy, which is pretty good after nuclear policy, and found myself in the middle of the great privatisation programme, because although it wasn't part of the 1979 manifesto, it became, Nick Ridley, of course, had been, I knew all about it because I did work with Nick Ridley in the Heath government. They wanted seriously to take it up, and we were asked in the department whether we could privatise, gas, electricity, coal, and we had a meeting, I remember, where someone said I could offer gas, and everyone roared with laughter, and I could offer electricity, and they fell off their chairs, and coal, and their tears ran down their eyes. Of course, it all happened. And Nigel Lawson became the Secretary of State, and called me down, because we started developing a national savings certificate, the coupon on which would be linked to the average price of a barrel of oil. It was, thank goodness it never got off the ground, but I was working on that for a bit, in lieu of privatisation. And Nigel Lawson called me down and said, if I told you that we were going to nationalise the British National Oil Corporation, that was the nationalised body that had a lot of North Sea interests, what is the quickest, what would be involved?
When you said nationalise, you mean privatise?
If I told you I wanted to privatise the British National Oil Corporation, which had a lot of our North Sea oil interests, what would be involved, and what would be the quickest timetable you could do it on? And I said, well, you'd have to pass a bill, you'd have to draw up a prospectus, you'd have to divide the corporation in two, because there's part of it you can't privatise, and then you'd have to have the offer for sale. And I think you could do that if everything went right, and you had everything, the Parliament was in your path, cleared the path and so on, and we had all the resources to pay the advisors, we could do it in a year. And he said to me, okay, that is what I want to do, I'm putting you in charge, I want you to privatise BNOC a year from now. But I will give you every backing you need, and the Prime Minister will give you every backing. We want this privatised, it has the will of the government, do it. Which is an extraordinary thing, because I remember at my first meeting with merchant bankers, I went out to a bookshop in Horseferry Road and found a Teach Yourself business book or finance book and looked up merchant bankers under M, because I had no idea what a merchant banker did. I stood in the bookshop and, as it were, read it up in textbooks. And it was a super project. There were lovely people in BNOC, Jenny Page, who later went on to do the Jubilee line and then the Millennium Dome, bless her, which she built to time and to cost. I want history to know that. And Roy Danzig, who was brought in from the private sector to be the finance director. And we did it. It was amazing. We got the bill act through Parliament, and we got the corporation split. There was terrific hostility inside the corporation, people leaking things to the Times, which is very unhelpful. And we drew up the prospectus. I'd never done a prospectus in my life before, but we had very good merchant bankers. Warburgs were terrific. Freshfields, the solicitors, were terrific. We had very good accountants. And we made it happen. And we did it to the day, pretty much, that Nigel Lawson wanted. And that was, I'm very proud of that. And it coincided with a dreadful period in my life, really. Because our son was born in 1979, March, and that was lovely. I mean, one of the most important things in life, that and the birth of our daughter in 1981. We'd moved out to Buckinghamshire. When we had family, we'd agreed we wanted to bring them up in the countryside with a village school and so on, and good schools. And so we chose a school up near Aylesbury in a village called Dinton, and it was a terrific choice. We bought an old bakery with 2 shops, and that was which we converted in a very. I did it all myself, and it was pretty badly done, but it was a lovely place to bring up children. But then, in a number of blows fell really. In January 1980, we found that Tom was profoundly deaf, which is a difficult moment, a dreadful, painful moment for my wife. But he's a fantastically bright chap, and he's done hugely well, got a first at university and so on, and he's a lovely chap. But dealing with profound deafness at that time was quite a struggle, and in our middle class way we didn't now fight to get what we wanted, which is oral rather than sign language and so on, auditory oral approach. And then my mother died in June of that year, 1980, and then my father died during committee stage on the oil and gas bill, and then my middle sister died in 1983. So that there was a period in my private life of deaths, and then my favourite uncle, who was very important to me, died in October in the middle of the offer for sale. So we had 3 or 4 deaths, and our son having this disability, which was really quite a sort of turbulent period. And yet out of it emerged a nuclear family, which is just the joy of my life. My wife and Tom and Amy, who really were terrific, and my career had a huge boost really from Nigel Lawson, for working successfully for Nigel Lawson. It was one of the early privatisations, about 2nd or 3rd, and it was hugely successful in the sense that the government made a lot of money. Because the oil price dropped in the middle of the offer for sale, I think a number of the underwriters had to take up the shares, which is a pity, but it showed it could be done. And for my own personal, it gave my career a boost. I got promoted, and I was put in charge of all personnel and all finance in the Department of Energy, a department I knew well. And I learnt then all the things I needed for the rest of my career, about running a department, about looking after finance, about looking after people management, and about what is actually involved in running a department. And it was a very good period. It was a very instructive period, and a nice department to cut your teeth on and to learn how to do those things. And I caught the eye of the centre. Peter Walker has been our Secretary of State, and that was itself an instruction, because he couldn't have been more different from Nigel Lawson. And you learnt that the difference of view between different ministers within a party can be as great as the differences of view between ministers in different political parties and different governments. But I was headhunted to go to head the personnel management division of the Cabinet Office, where I dealt with personnel management policy for the civil service as a whole, which I only did for a short period, 18 months. And then I had another fantastic break. I was summoned in by Robert Armstrong, the then Cabinet Secretary, who asked me, said, I was jolly lucky, but there was no one else available at the time, would I please head the Domestic and Economic Secretariat of the Cabinet Office under Mrs. Thatcher? And I thought, for goodness sake, I mean, this is, I was saying earlier, this is, life stretching you again. I was pretty nervous because she had a reputation of being, quite demanding to work for. And my first morning, I had half an hour handover with my predecessor, a nice man called Brian Unwin. And I said to him, any tips for dealing with the Prime Minister? And he said, well, he's a very patrician man. He said, you'll be sitting next to her quite often, as you do, as secretary of any meeting. Unless it's the cabinet, you sit at the end, but as secretary of any committee, you sit next to the Prime Minister. At least my job was to sit next to her. He said, she likes to make a good exit, pick up her hat. She'll put her handbag down between your seat and hers, and she likes to make a good exit, seize her handbag and say, we must get on with work, and march out. Do not get the legs of your chair mixed up with the straps of her handbag, or you'll spoil her exit. I did that, and she didn't forgive me for months. But anyway, so I met her, and she was indeed formidable and demanding, and she used the brief. And I had my heart in my mouth at the beginning, because she was full of energy and very different at every meeting. You never knew what way she had great performance, and she'd come in. She would have to go in the room first. You waited outside the room. There'd be a flash of blue or a flash of green, whatever colour, and the hair and the shoulder pads, and all these grey men would then rush in to be after her. because if you didn't get in quickly, she'd say sometimes, well, this paper is completely wrong. What we should be doing is X, Y, and Z. Don't you agree, Secretary of State? Poor man who'd put the paper forward. And if you missed that, you'd miss the summing up, as it were. So it was quite important to get into the room. So I had, in those years, but then after 3 months, Robert Armstrong called me in, and he said, "You're okay." He said, "She thinks you're okay. You're through. You've passed the test. Congratulations. You'll do." And I was in the stockade. And then she'd accepted me. And then after that, she gave me lots of things to do. And she relied heavily on the briefs which I wrote, which could be scary. I can remember her, saying, "But the brief says this, and you say that. Which of you is right?" And the whole cabinet would be sitting there staring at you, knowing that you'd written the brief, and your palms of your hand open, and all sorts of. It was a very exciting period, and it was full of radical change. The curriculum went through. The abolition of the GLC went through, the NHS reforms we had a committee I was secretary of, which ultimately Mr. Blair took up again, went through everything, a huge amount of government. Local government was reorganised, the poll tax went through. I sat there minuting all this and briefing her, and then having to tell departments to go on and chairing little groups on this, that and the next thing, including how to make the poll tax work, the community charge work after she had after it really, that's not for now, that's for another interview, but there was a whole saga of the community charge, which I found myself deeply involved in. I went to Chequers. I was summoned to Chequers, which mercifully, by coincidence, was not far from where we lived in Dinton, on a Saturday afternoon to explain to her a very complicated submission I'd put to her about local government finance, about how to try and adjust the poll tax, which is going wrong. It was don't ever get into local government finance. It is incredibly difficult stuff. And she always had this theory, I think, that I didn't eat enough. So she got a tea for me, and she made me sit there with a cup of tea in one hand and this sort of great cream bun with sort of icing, dusting of icing sugar on it, explaining to her. I had nowhere to put it down. Explaining to her about all these difficult financial changes which we, in the formula for local government finance, we were putting forward to. So that was, and she was, you'll find civil servants who worked for her have huge admiration for her, because she was a very good person to work for. Not necessarily a good person to be a minister in her government. She would be very tough with them. But her civil servants, you'll find, many of us have a very warm regard for her, and she treated us well. Once she accepted you, as it were, as being inside the stockade. No, it wasn't one of us. She never showed any interest in my politics. She'd have been offended if I had obtruded a political thought. And she wasn't in the least bit interested. She could do the politics, thank you. What she wanted was a good service. Someone who could get on top of the brief, master it, understand where she's coming from, and then deal with departments in a way that made things happen in the way she wanted, and draw up proposals that reflected her thinking. Or if there's a problem, she could trust you that it really was a problem and you weren't just being difficult. Do you know what I mean? But if she felt that the service you were providing was the quality she needed, then she gave you absolute support, and she would be a very rewarding person to work for. She'd use your briefs, she'd use your arguments, she'd do them better, or she'd change them, but it was really interesting. And she'd rely on you sometimes, in moments where you knew that if you let her down, she would be in some trouble. She would rely on you, and she'd trust you to do it. And then if you did it, she'd say thank you. I think she's a much more complex and interesting woman, and quite unlike the kind of, a lot of it seen from the sort of place I was in, was quite unlike the sort of image, the spitting image of her. Though there was some truth in it, as always, like there's some truth in Yes Minister, but it's no means the whole story. And I was very privileged. I had a ringside seat of watching the Thatcher government at work for 3 years, which is absolutely the best show in town. So lucky man. And then I was moved by my Robin Butler, who's the cabinet secretary, to the Treasury, because the Treasury think everyone ought to have time in the Treasury. So I did for 2 years. I was in the Treasury, and I had responsibility for half of all public expenditure, which at that time was nothing like what it is now. But I think it was about 98 billion but £8, and it was about allocation between departments and dealing with departments who were wanting funding. And I learned the Treasury job, really, which is about how you say no and how you deal with people who are trying to bounce things through. And you see it from the other side. Having spent many years myself doing that to the Treasury, it's quite good to find yourself at the receiving end of the sort of treatment you used to deliver to them. And that was interesting. And then in 1992, at the election, John Major, who I'd known quite well from working in the Cabinet Office, promoted me to being Permanent Secretary of the Department of the Environment. And that was a huge jump, because I knew nothing about the department, except I knew about local government finance, but I didn't know about the environment, although I'd chaired Mrs. Thatcher's environmental committee. But I didn't know the department or the people. I knew quite a lot of the people in it, but it was a big step up, and being a Permanent Secretary is a big thing in government, and I did that for Michael Howard, who was and we repealed the community charge poll tax, introduced the council tax, and Michael Howard did quite a lot on the environment, climate change. The Rio summit he went to in my first week, and I learned, practiced, cut my teeth as a Permanent Secretary then. And after a year, he was promoted or moved to the Home Office. And I remember saying goodbye to him and saying, congratulations and bad luck. He said, why? And I said, congratulations, because it is one of the most important Secretaries of State in the government. Bad luck, because I think it is one of the most thankless jobs there is in government, because you gather all the failings of every other policy and of every other department, like education, the dropouts from education and so on. Or the people in the National Health Service has failed who've got mental health problems, and your problems are insoluble probably, but good luck and congratulations and so on. And then John Gummer came in, and I had a good year with John Gummer, who's hugely competent departmental minister. Took a department which other people had a lot of trouble with and quietened it down and knew his policies and laid down the policies, and the man who and interestingly, I'd seen in Cambridge. I used to go to the Union every Tuesday. I'd seen Michael Howard, John Gummer, Kenneth Clarke, Norman Lamont, seen them all in action. I'd never spoken myself, but I'd observed them. And then I worked for each of them. Very odd. I worked with Norman Lamont in the Department of Energy, Kenneth Clarke when he was in Urban Cities in the Cabinet Office, Michael Howard and John Gummer. Very odd. So all my generation, really. And then, out of nowhere, out of a clear blue sky, without warning, it must have been April 94, Robin Butler rang me up and said, the Prime Minister wants you to go to the Home Office, Permanent Under Secretary. And I really didn't said my opinion of the department. I didn't know the department at all. And it became very clear very fast that it was that Michael Howard had asked for me, I think, which I hadn't known he'd done. He never contacted me or anything. And I found myself in a very invidious position, because the Civil Service had wanted someone else to get the job, and that was really quite difficult stuff. And the department was in some uproar, because Michael Howard had made a speech at the Conservative Party conference without, I think, consulting the department, or certainly as much as they thought they ought to have been consulted, in which he'd said things like prison works, it's a 30-point plan, which the department was in some disarray over. So I said to Robin, can I think about it, can I come and see you in the morning? And went to see him, and I said, if you tell me I've got to do it, if you tell me that John Major and you want me to do it, of course I'll do it. But it isn't my instant choice. I've only just settled into the Department of the Environment. And Robin said, we want you to do it. And so I went and did it. And it was a really, really, really difficult period, because not only was Michael Howard at odds with the department, but also within months of my being there, we had a very serious escape from Whitemoor, which took up, and then 3 months later, Parkhurst. And the inquiries into that and the subsequent dismissal of the Director General of the Prison Service, which I had to handle, of Derek Lewis, consumed me, my life, and as well as huge reforms, management reforms of the Home Office, which we carried out. All the experience I'd had before came together, and talk about life, Civil Service throwing me at me a demanding job. And I was regarded with great suspicion initially by the Home Office, whom I had staff who I had to win over. And I think when I left, I think I had won them over. But I also had to deal with the Department of Environment, who felt let down that I'd left them after only 2 years. And I'd promised them so many things we were doing and asked them to do things, and I felt very bad about leaving them. So that was a very demanding bit of career. But crime went down for the first time in a century. Crime went down in my 4 years at the Home Office, and we did reorganise the Home Office, and we did do some very much needed management changes, like introducing computers, IT. They had virtually no IT in the Immigration Service when I arrived. They had one word processor on every floor of this enormous building, and they had messengers whose job was just to keep the paper up to date, and I got lots of people. I recruited lots of people to help us out, and did lots of staff changes in my first year, and that was a really challenging job. And then, of course, we had. By the end of it, I think after 3 years, we'd roughly got it all in place. And then we had the election. The Blair government was swung to power on a huge majority. I'd had all the talks in opposition, Jack Straw, who I knew slightly because I knew his wife, Alice Perkins, who was a civil servant and a friend. All the things I talked about in his government happened, only this time I was the permanent secretary doing the ringing up of the private office and say, get in touch with so-and-so. And we met and we waited for Jack Straw, who we'd expected to be appointed, to come. And as we waited for him to come, I said to the private secretary, have we emptied the drawers? And of course we hadn't emptied the drawers. They were full of all Michael's, checkbooks or aspirins or, gifts that people had given him left behind. So someone produced a couple of Waitrose carrier bags. We flung them in, and I found a cupboard. And I opened the cupboard, which had not been opened for many years, because when I opened it, there at the back were some elephant tusks with Henry Brooks' name on them. It's extraordinary. He'd been Home Secretary in the 60s. Very odd. Anyway, and we got on with Jack Straw, and that was a good period. Jack Straw knew what he wanted, was a very easy man to get on with, and was full of enthusiasm, and so on. That went well. And then in July 1997, there'd been lots of press speculation about Robin Butler's succession, which I had been named. I had not spoken to the press at all. I think there's a sense of competition developing. And I kept my head down and get on with the job. And one afternoon I got a morning phone call saying the Prime Minister would like to meet you. No mention about jobs or anything. Would you come across at 5 o'clock and talk to him? So I went across and met Tony Blair and sat on the balcony outside the cabinet room, and we chatted about everything under the sun, really, and for about an hour, and then that was it. And we didn't talk about the job or anything. And then I got a couple of days later a phone call saying Derry Irvine would like to meet you at 8:30 tomorrow. Will you go? I knew Derry Irvine, though he didn't remember me because he'd been at Cambridge, and the last time I'd seen him was on a pub crawl down Fleet Street. And he had, interestingly, had rung Bill Wedderburn about me. So I discovered afterwards. I discovered an interview because he said, "You know Bill Wedderburn?" So that's anyway, and we had a chat. Again, no reference to anything in particular. And then about 3 days later, I got a phone call from Robin Butler asking me to go to see him. And he said, I'm not telling you this, but Tony Blair's going to ask to see you this afternoon at 5 o'clock. And he's going to ask you to be Cabinet Secretary, and I want to be sure you're going to give the right answer. But don't show him that you know that he's going to ask you. Let him ask you. Don't tell him you've spoken to me or anything. So I sort of reeled away. And sure enough, I got the phone call. I went to see Tony Blair. He said, come in. Now I want to talk to you about the press release. And I said, what about? And he said, you know perfectly well what it's about. Robin Butler will have told you. So I don't think I was ever offered the job. Anyway, so then I became Secretary of the Cabinet and Head of the Civil Service. And I had a few more months at the Home Office. Sad period, because Carrie's sister, lovely Sue Lee, who taught at St Paul's, Deputy High Mistress at St Paul's, died of cancer. That was, as it were, dominated that period. And then in 1st of January 1998, I became Secretary of the Cabinet and Head of the Civil Service. And that was a job I did till September 2002. and it was a period of extraordinary period, which I'm not going to cover, I think, with you, unless what do you want to ask me about it?
Well, I've just one or two things, because I know you have talked about it to other people. I mean, firstly, Blair obviously has a very, very engaging personality and so on. How did you reckon him as a person?
You could not ask for an easier minister in terms at that level. In terms of, he's the most sweet-natured, easygoing guy. I use the word because that's his sort of word. You could ask for. I've known him angry, but not. He's very controlled, and it is very rarely lets irritation, let alone anger. He doesn't lose his temper, and he's someone who you can be direct with and honest with and say what you think, and he will not take offence, and he won't hold it against you, which is rare. And those are good qualities, and his charisma, his charm, is quite extraordinary. He can walk into a room and people who are hostile and against him, he can talk them round, he can persuade them. And he picks things up quickly, and he'd say, "Why am I seeing this chap?" And I'd say, "Because you want him to take this appointment, he doesn't want to do it." "Oh, sure, okay." And then he'd do it. And he would just, and people, Roy Jenkins said to me, "You know, what's your Blair factor?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, when I saw Tony, initially I would walk tall for a month, and then I think, what have I actually got out of it? And then talk tall for a fortnight." And he can give you a sense of huge excitement and pleasure, and you're part of it, and then you're not actually sure what he said. And I've sat there writing notes, and people think he said something, I think this is at the root of at least some of the tensions which we can now admit existed between Blair and Brown, because I don't think Gordon ever listened quite to what Tony said, but he'd know if you wrote it down he hadn't said it, but people would think he had. And he can charm people, and he also has a performing style which is to die for, really. He can find the right words. I've seen him, Alistair Campbell, just giving him a few phrases, going out talking to the media and just finding the language in a way that is and cool. I mean, it's what turns him on in a way, is that he's a performer of extraordinary calibre. And I've sat next to him when he's delivered a speech to a hostile audience in the darkness up there, the television cameras on you and the bright lights. I've sat along the platform with him in perfectly properly, not political occasions, but and you can feel him reaching out and talking, a real skill which I think very few people I've ever worked for have got in that kind of degree, and an ability to to tune into an audience, read them, and pull them round, and as it were engage with them, and as it were redirect the way they're feeling. And I think he's absolutely superb. And the truth is that his skills and Gordon Brown's skills are complementary, and between them they had all the skills you needed when they worked together well, which sometimes they did, which you need in a really remarkable prime minister. But the politics of it, as the world knows, were much more difficult than that. But Blair's a much more complex man than I'm making him sound, because all different things coexist with him. I mean, there's the easygoing guy who I've described, very affable, one of the lads, and then there's the charmer and the orator. And then there's the really tough guy who sacked Peter Mandelson the second time. Really, he had it in him. So I remember seeing him, granite-faced, and he's the man who is living on a world stage, who's, I think, in some ways more comfortable on the world stage, comfortable in a way that none of us would be. Mm-hmm. He is at ease with himself, bestriding the colossus, bestriding the globe like a colossus, in a way which is, I think, unusual. And so all sorts of, and he can be cunning, he can be quite political, very political, extremely political, and I don't know what the word manipulative is, but he can just move people and deal with difficult things and glide through narrow impasses where you think there's no room. So he's all sorts of different skills, people coexist with him, and so he is all the things you just said, but he's also very complex, and much more complex man than behind that. I think he's well concealed. I think he's well camouflaged.
Two further questions. One is, you pointed to all his strengths. What would you say if you were a headmaster? writing the report on his weaknesses?
I'm not sure I'm going to get into that game now.
Okay.
I mean, I think...
you have implied some of it. But
I've implied some of them.
Yeah.
And I've implied it when I say he and Gordon have the skills between them, because he isn't always a man to read all the papers, whereas Gordon will know what's in Annex E, paragraph 23, and why it conflicts with paragraph 24 of the main paper. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Gordon has to do it all himself. Tony will be perfectly happy to leave that to other people. And I think the question, let me put it this way, I think the question which history will ask is what did Blair achieve in the Blair years? Because he was in the most powerful position you could possibly imagine for a Prime Minister. He was powerful in the cabinet. They were so grateful to win power and to be back in government, and most of them were new to it, so they all had steep learning curves. There were only 4 or 5 people in the 119 ministers in the first Blair government who had ever been in government before, so there was a huge mass learning experience going on. He was powerful in Parliament, because the backbenchers, many of them knew, were pretty hugely loyal and supportive and adoring of him. The Labour Party was quiescent, the trade unions were quiescent, the economy was prosperous for longer than it had been for many years, and the opinion polls gave the government and Blair a higher rating, more consistently high than anyone had ever had since polling began. So in terms of power, he was powerful. I think the question which I've just asked is, what did he achieve, what did he use that power for?
The other question is that certainly from some vantage points, he seemed to change government in the sense that it seemed to become more and more centralised, in the sense of at one time it was the Crown and Parliament, and then it was Parliament, and then it was the Cabinet, and then it was the sofa. I think I've written an article about this in Political Quarterly, so I think I'm on record a bit on this. I think that he started off from a very centralised position. I think he'd never worked in a department. I think it was a handicap, never having worked in a government department, never managed, and none of the people around him had managed anything of that sort of any reasonable scale. And I think he felt that he could probably do a lot. The control tower analogy used to be very much in currency, and I think that they believed. I think New Labour were very confident in themselves, and they didn't have the experience to do things, but they believed they could do it. And so you had that proliferation of targets initially. I remember the NHS coming to see me, the chap from the NHS coming to see me to say, "No, we've got 72 top priorities now. Can you tell me? Can you find out for me which are the important ones? Because no one with 72 top priorities can give them all top priority." And so there was a great debate in which I was deeply involved about how you actually relate to, how you actually make things happen in government. And cabinet committee system, he didn't. He was very unwilling to use. And I think so. There are all sorts of and I think this centralisation, the destruction. One of the most, quite often the most important things that happen in government happen unnoticed. It's very odd. And one of the things that's happened, and it began under Mrs. Thatcher, but it accelerated hugely over the last decade, was that local government, a whole tier of democratic accountability, was effectively destroyed. Local government, and Nick Ridley had made a speech about this, wrote a paper about this in the 80s. Local government has become an agent of central government rather than its own tier of local government. And that was part of the centralisation. And then the state started behaving as though it didn't trust the public. And that was partly the fault of terrorism. But this is since I ceased being Cabinet Secretary. I think the way in which closed-circuit television, and every time you go through an airport and you give, or if you're a teacher in a primary school, you can't cuddle the children because you may be a paedophile, or I think there's a huge sense in which, or if you're a driver, you can't drive without being photographed by cameras. It may be that there are people who you don't trust, but to treat everybody equally as though they're not trustworthy, it indicates a loss of trust of government in the public, which I think is quite a serious change in the climate in which we conduct our civil liberties. And I think the centralisation of government power, the wish to attract power, not only into government, but within government into the centre,
is also serious, so that things which would previously have been announced by a Secretary of State become announced by the Prime Minister. You expect the Prime Minister to answer for everything, whereas you can't say that's a matter for my right honourable friend and legitimately expect my right honourable friend to make the announcement. The Prime Minister has to do it. I think all these things have become greatly accentuated, and it's again partly a lack of trust by the centre in government departments. So I think it's too complex to deal with now, but there are quite serious issues there.
Were you on Cabinet Secretary in the Iraq War?
No, I was there for the first Iraq bombing, which no one remembers now, with Clinton. But I left. Although technically I went on in the job till the end of September 2002, my last day of work was around the 2nd of September 2002, which was the Friday before the Monday when the government ordered the preparation of the dossier, what became known as the dodgy dossier, and that was the build-up to the Iraq War began in earnest that autumn.
So we won't go into that any further. Well, we've only got a few minutes, so can we just end up perhaps by coming back to Cambridge? Because
which is what I did.
Yes, which is what you did and what you're doing now as Master of Emmanuel. Why did you want to become the Master, or did you accept when they rang you up?
They rang me. No, I was elected. I wish you to know I have democratic legitimacy in this post. I'm elected by the fellowship in a competition with other people.
Yes, of course.
So let us not think Cambridge did.
No, I was meaning they rang you up to say you have got it, rather than.
Oh no! I see. No. I competed. I hadn't thought about it. I really hadn't thought about retirement. I was flat out after 9/11, and I was rung up and told that if I wished to apply for the job. They were advertising for it. The closing date had passed, but they would extend it if I wished to apply. That was the way they put it. So, and initially, I was too busy. I was actually really. It was the beginning of all the stuff in Afghanistan, and it was really, really frantic period. And then Lord St John of Fawsley approached me and said, "Why didn't I just go and see the college?" And really, I went to see it, and I met the fellowship, and I saw around the college. And I talked to the bursar and development director, senior tutor, and I then dined at high table, and I sat in the parlour, and I moved from table to table, and I chatted to people, and I walked back on a crisp November evening across the grass of Front Court and looked up the Wren Chapel, and I suddenly thought, I really could get to like this. This could be a marvellous thing to do. It reconnected with things which I had talked about long ago in this interview. It reconnected with my Cambridge past, and I suddenly thought, wouldn't this be marvellous? So when they invited me to do it, I then took it seriously. I applied, I did all the correct things, I went through all the hoops, and they very kindly, and I'm hugely appreciated, I much appreciate the fellowship's honour they did me, elected me to the post. I accepted it, of course, because it was what I wanted. And when I came here, I felt as though I'd died and gone to heaven. I cannot tell you how the contrast between government and Cambridge is, and I haven't stopped feeling like that.
What is the contrast?
Oh, so many things. First, the lack of stress. I chair lots of meetings here, and I still haven't ever quite turned off the alarms, and I think nothing that anyone is discussing here is going to appear in the Daily Mail tomorrow. I don't have to go and brief Alistair Campbell, or go and tell the Prime Minister we've got a problem, or ring up a department and ask them that they do something as quickly as possible, like by 10 o'clock tonight, or have to drop everything because foot and mouth disease is going wrong. I don't have to, and so the lack of stress is just superb. And if I used to walk into my private office in Cabinet Office and say, "So what's happened? What's the news?" And they'd say, "We've got a slight problem, which is," and then something ghastly would emerge. Someone has done something terrible, and it's about, and the press are onto it, and it's being blamed on you, and would you go and see the Prime Minister? It's that sort of everyday life, and it would always be something really serious, or we've got 24 hours in which to deal with some awful problem, or else it's going to Parliament will summon you, and you just have all the time, you are juggling, it's surfing, you're juggling difficult issues which you have to be alert to. You can't have a day off. You can't have a poor day. You have to be ready and able to do it and deal with people, and people behaving difficultly or badly or wickedly or foolishly, usually foolishly. And you just have to be prepared to see them and drop things and reorganize your diary, but also keep the other balls in the air and do the 2 boxes of papers in the car on the way home so that they're done by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Here, the pace is so much kinder. And I don't have to do 2 boxes at night, and I don't have the feeling that everything's matter. They matter to individuals, they matter to the college, they are important in the context of Cambridge. But you don't feel that actually if you get it wrong, people in the large scale in the public are you're going to let them down, or you're going to get it wrong in a way which lets the government down. Or you're going to be lampooned in Daily Mail, which I have been. It is so. And the other thing that's different about Cambridge is that whereas in the civil service, is that discussion tends to be divergent. I'm speaking this knowingly to a fellow of kings. Discussion tends to be divergent, whereas in government it's convergent. In government, if you have a meeting at this table, you may have 20 people there, they know you've got an hour, you know you've got a problem, you know you've got to reach a solution by the end of the hour, and people have got to sign up to it. Or if they aren't able to sign up to it, you've got to isolate and identify the points of difference and a procedure whereby they'll be sorted out probably by the end of the day, and certainly within the next 24 hours. So that you'd have a discussion, everyone has to have a chance to argue, the argument has to be disciplined, pretty taut. Everyone must use their arguments effectively, they must be on top of the facts, and you've got to get to a solution by the end of the time. Because you've got another meeting, you've got another crisis, or the Prime Minister wants to see you at 5, you know. And people understand that. So that although they're all fighting their departmental corners often, they know what you've got to do, and they know the rules of the game, and they know that you've got to have a decision. So you can run it that way, and you can make sure that part of your job is to make sure that the cabinet government, the system, delivers the results on the timetable which is needed by the government of the day. Cambridge, you have an issue. People have no sense that the decision's got to be taken necessarily, and if you let them take up a position too deeply, they'll regard it as a matter of honour that they can defend their position, and they dig themselves more deeply and spend a lot of time and effort proving that they're right and the other person's wrong, and the discussion will be divergent. It'll go all sorts of places unless you're very careful. So the skills you need are very different. Now, sometimes chairing permanent secretaries on a Wednesday morning, which is the classic meeting, discussion could be like that. So life has given me some preparation for this, but the skills you need and the techniques you need for Cambridge are different, and also the timescales are different. And you know, the timescale, it's joy to me that you don't have to do it by 10 o'clock tonight.
Lovely. Well, there's just 3 minutes. Is there anything really that I've missed that's really important? You've talked about your family, or but I wouldn't want to miss one important part of your life.
No, Dinton. We left Dinton, I suppose. That village we moved to in '78. We left it. We finally sold our house in 2005. We bought a house in Cambridge. I'm very sad to leave Dinton, but it wasn't right for these later years of our life. It had no shops, and the bus service was pretty poor. You had to drive a long way to get to anywhere. And I think to move into Cambridge is marvellous. So we have rooted ourselves up. My mother-in-law lived here ever since her husband died. So we came and we're here for her final years. And we have, as it were, made our home back here. And in a way, it's the right place to be, because for both of us, it's such an important place to live and to work and to spend our final years. So we've thrown our lot in with Cambridge, and I just want to come back to the same point I made earlier, which I don't think many people are as lucky as I've been.
Well, that's a lovely point to end on. Thank you very much indeed.